Welcome back to the Breakfast Club. I'm Shilda Ismail, and as usual, we have a segment. We have a breakfast with a personality. And today we have Mr. Kamal Malhotra. He's the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Malaysia, and we'll be talking about eradicating poverty. All right. Thank you for joining us in the Breakfast Club. Have you got your breakfast this morning?
Yes, I did.
Yes?
Yes.
I understand you're a tea person, not a coffee person. So normally what do you have for breakfast?
I just have some cereal in the morning.
I just said one of the news anchors, he always had cereal, and I said to him, you're a serial killer. Are you serial? All right.
Well, certain kind of cereal.
Okay, certain kind of cereal. All right. Tell us about yourself, your background in Malaysia. How long have you been particularly in Malaysia?
I've been in Malaysia now almost exactly 2.5 years.
All right.
Heading the United Nations for Malaysia, but I also represent the UN for Singapore and Brunei, Darussalam. I've been with the UN overall about 11 years. Before this, I was in New York with the United Nations in the headquarters.
All right, based in New York.
Based in New York.
Okay. On April 28, the United Nations country team, the Malaysian team, together with the Economic Planning Unit EPU, launched the much-awaited Millennium Development Goals MDG Report 2010. This is the report, the Millennium Development Goals at 2010. So perhaps you can tell us about the MDG program. What is it about?
Yeah, in 2000, at the turn of the millennium, 189 world leaders, presidents, prime ministers from around the world came together in New York at the United Nations, and they signed the Millennium Declaration. This is the first time that 189 leaders have agreed to common goals to eradicate poverty, to improve education opportunities, health, the status of women, and a whole range of other goals. So this is what the Millennium Declaration was about. The Millennium Declaration was then translated by experts, United Nations experts, World Bank experts, into 8 time-bound goals, which are to be achieved by 2015. And the base year for measuring progress is 1990. So let's say, looking at 1990, that was the situation, and then you have these goals, which are in different areas. Only one area is poverty. But other goals relate to health, they relate to the environment, they relate to HIV and AIDS, they relate to education, they relate to gender. And in each of these areas, there are goals, there are targets. And so what we have produced and what we have done in the last, since 2000, is that every 5 years, we produce, if you like, a report card. As the Prime Minister says in his foreword.
Yardstick.
Yeah, so this is the Millennium Development Goal for Malaysia at 2010. Which is 5 years before 2015, which is when, all these goals were supposed to have been achieved.
Okay, let's skew to Malaysia here. Speaking on Malaysian poverty line. Malaysian poverty line is at 4.9%. How poor or rich as we compare to other counterparts?
Well, let me start by saying that Malaysia has done a very good job on reducing poverty from the 1990 base overall. In aggregate terms. So Malaysia has met MDG goal number 1. There are 8 goals, only 1 is on poverty. So Malaysia has done quite well overall on reducing poverty, on halving poverty between 1990, and it did this in advance of 2015. But this report goes at a disaggregated level as well. And when we start looking at a disaggregated level, then we find that particularly the state of Sabah still has very high levels of poverty. And so overall Sabah has poverty now still, using 2009 data, of still almost 20%. And then when you go to rural Sabah, poverty in rural Sabah is in excess of 30%. Almost 1/3 of people, rural Sabahan people, live in poverty still. That's quite a large number for a country like Malaysia when you compare it with the overall average that you mentioned.
Can you describe it, or can you definition of poverty in Sabah? I mean,
Well, firstly, the UN's definition of poverty is not reduced to one figure, not just an income figure. We take a multi-dimensional approach to poverty. We are actually helping Malaysia now develop a multi-dimensional index, which looks at health status, which looks at educational status, which looks at what the United Nations Development Program calls human poverty, not just income poverty. And so there you need to look at a very wide range of factors. And you have to look at whether people have access to the right type of shelter, the right type of education, what level of education, what type of health, how do they do on a whole range of attributes. But even if you just look at income poverty, when I talk about 30% and rural Sabah, they are not on track to achieve the MDGs in rural Sabah. So our estimate, according to the report at this stage, is that while Malaysia as a whole is on track, when you disaggregate it, rural Sabah is not on track and will not achieve the MDG goal on poverty by 2015. So there needs much more concerted, much more accelerated action with a focus on Sabah as a whole, but rural Sabah. And here I want to stress, we are only talking about Malaysian citizens. So, you know, some people have asked, are you counting migrants? No. The data that we have in this report is on Malaysian citizens. If you started including migrants in Sabah, then of course the picture would be worse.
This is interesting. Next to Sabah in Malaysia, which country is considered below the line of poverty?
Well, I mean, in Malaysia as a whole, as I said, all other states are meeting the poverty target. There are other areas where Malaysia, even as a whole, is not doing as well as it should be. For example, maternal mortality.
Maternal mortality, all right.
While Malaysia has done quite well compared to many other developing countries, given that Malaysia now has an aspiration to be a developed country by 2020, there's still a huge gap between Malaysia's maternal mortality rate, which is roughly 28-29 per 100,000 live births. 28.9.
28.9.
To give you an exact figure.
Mortality ratio, yeah?
Yeah. Now, in 1990, it was 44. And therefore, if you were to achieve the MDG goal in maternal mortality, which is to reduce by 3/4 by 2015, then by 2015, Malaysia should be 11. But 28.9 and 11 are quite a distance. And when you look at developed countries, their maternal mortality rate is around 6 per 100,000 live births. So while Malaysia has done well compared to some other developing countries, it is unlikely that it can meet this goal of the MDGs by 2015, and it still has quite a distance to travel.
Why is that so? Is it because of the awareness, or?
No, I think that there are a range of complicated factors. Some of them are very technical in terms of the medical side of things. But I say that some of them may relate also to access to reproductive health. Because another area in which we find Malaysia not doing so well is its contraceptive prevalence rate.
Contraceptive prevalence
rate. There's another goal which relates to universal access to reproductive health, and one part of that is universal access to contraception. But we find that Malaysia's contraceptive prevalence rate has remained unchanged since 1984.
Since 1984?
Roughly. And so that's about 25 years, and it's roughly only about 50%. And this is data basically for married women. There isn't the data for unmarried women in Malaysia. So there is that gap to be filled, but that contraceptive rate has not really fallen. And those who want access to contraception but are not getting it, that figure has risen.
I see.
So there is a relationship between that and maternal mortality as well. Because obviously some people who don't have access to contraception are at greater risk of maternal mortality. So there is a link, but there are other factors as well. And so there is a need, and what we try to do in this report is to focus on some of the underlying reasons. And we are here to support the Malaysian government and the Malaysian people in addressing these remaining challenges.
Speaking on working together with the government. Which agencies are you working together?
Well, the UN as a whole, works with a very wide range of government agencies. The United Nations Development Program works closely with the Economic Planning Unit in the Prime Minister's Department, but also with 10 other ministries, from the Ministry of Natural Resources to the Environment, to the Ministry of Health, to a range of other ministries. UNICEF works closely with the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare, etc., Ministry of Education. The WHO, the World Health Organization, works closely with the Ministry of Health. We, of course, all work in one way or another with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But there's a very wide range of agencies. The UN Population Fund also works with the Ministry of Women, and particularly with the Population Fund, part of the Ministry of Women, the population part of the Ministry of Women. So there's a very wide range of organizations that the UN as a whole works with. We also try and interact as much as possible with civil society organizations. They have an important role to play. But our main partner in a country like Malaysia is the government. Yeah.
All right. Your alliances with government. Speaking on success stories, perhaps you can tell us, if there were a community or a country who was poor, but UN has managed to things around. Is that success story,
Yeah, well, I'll relate it to the Millennium Development Goals specifically, because we're talking about a Millennium Development Goal report. In large parts of Africa, the UN has adopted what they call Millennium Development Goal villages. And so there you have, in a place like Kenya, for example, you've had in a concentrated sort of geographic space a lot of inputs which are aimed at achieving all 7 or 8 of the Millennium Development Goals. And there's been quite a lot of success. The big question then is, can this be sustained? Because you're putting a lot of concentrated resources, but for it to be sustained, the government has to take it over. But there are a number of success stories all around the world. And of course, Malaysia in its own right, as I said, has done quite well in aggregate terms on a number of the goals, but there's still remaining challenges.
Yeah, the few areas that you need to be improved, and according to you, to improve maternal health and to reduce by 3/4 of the maternal mortality ratio. I wish I can have you, and we'll probably have you in the next, next program in the Breakfast Club. We don't have much time. We have to give way to the next news. That's all we have for the Breakfast Club. I'm Shilda Ismail. Be sure to stay tuned to Astro 502 Bernama TV for the latest headlines. Signing off, Shilda Ismail. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.